Widow with 5 children whispered, "We haven't eaten in days." The cowboy said, "You'll never go hungry again." Ash Hollow, Wyoming Territory, December 1884. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the open plain, tearing through the crooked wooden buildings of Ash Hollow. Snow blew sideways through the town's only thoroughfare, coating the ground in thick drifts of white. What had once been muddy earth was now frozen solid, cracked, cruel, and unforgiving. It was morning, but the sky above was the color of lead. At the edge of the town's open-air market, what remained of it during the long winter months, a man was carving up a freshly hunted deer. Blood steamed against the snow as he worked, knife flashing in rhythm. Around him, a few townsfolk bartered in hushed tones, shoulders hunched, breath clouding in the air. Beyond the stall, just off the path where footprints quickly vanished in the flurries, stood a woman. Still, silent, like frostroot frozen in place. She wore a patched wool coat, too thin for the season, pulled tightly around her shoulders. In one arm, she held a baby whose face was nearly swallowed in the folds of her shawl. 4 more children huddled close to her legs, faces pale, noses red, eyes wide with a hunger that had stopped whining and started settling into bone. The woman's name was Lillian Harper, 32, widow. Once the wife of a carpenter in Missouri, now just another shadow in the West. They had walked 3 days through snowfall to reach Ash Hollow, carrying only what their backs could bear. She didn't step forward. She didn't cry out or beg. Instead, as the butcher wiped his hands and turned to the next customer, she whispered. Her voice barely rose above the wind, but the words carried like iron through the cold. "We haven't eaten in days." The butcher didn't hear, or pretended not to. A woman with a thick scarf over her mouth tugged her child away. Someone chuckled from the saloon down the street, the sound cutting across the moment like a blade. Lillian bowed her head. Then, movement. Across the square, in the shadow of the blacksmith's forge, stood a man. His coat was dark, his hat pulled low. He had the look of someone who did not make a sound unless it mattered. Wade Monroe, a name most in town had heard, but few spoke to. He was a ranch hand at the Mustang Ridge spread, a loner, a former cavalryman. His eyes, when visible, were the color of old storm clouds. He watched the scene from the shadows, saying nothing. Then, he stepped forward. No fanfare, no greeting, just the creak of his boots in the snow. He unslung his saddlebag and knelt down before the children, slowly, so as not to startle them. From within the leather, he pulled out a round of hard bread, a cloth-wrapped piece of smoked meat, and a small tin of beans. One by one, he placed them in the children's hands. The youngest reached out too eagerly, nearly dropping her share. Wade caught it and gave her a nod, not a smile, but something softer, like a promise. Lillian blinked, stunned. "Why would you?" But Wade was already walking away. He didn't speak, didn't wait for thanks. He simply adjusted his coat against the cold and disappeared around the side of the blacksmith's forge, like a shadow slipping back into the dark. One of the boys looked up at his mother. "Mama, who was that man?" Lillian clutched her baby tighter, still staring at the space where the man had vanished. "I don't know," she murmured. But something in her voice sounded less like despair now, and more like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to draw it. Around them, the town kept moving. The butcher served the next customer. The wind howled. The snow fell. But, for 5 hungry children and one mother on the edge of breaking, a stranger's quiet act had just held back the darkness. For one more night. The morning after the snowstorm, Ash Hollow stirred beneath a slate-gray sky. The wind had settled, but the cold still bit through wool and skin. Wade Monroe was already awake, as he always was before dawn. He had stabled his mare outside the feed store and stood with his back to the rising sun, sipping black coffee from a battered tin cup. Wade was a man few spoke to, and even fewer understood. Once, years back, He had ridden with the cavalry, part of the Union's Western campaigns. Folks said he had seen too much, and said too little since. Now he worked for Mustang Ridge, a rugged ranch 10 miles north, where he broke wild horses gentler than most men could hold a rope. He was paid in hay, winter shelter, and the solitude he never asked to explain. He lived alone in the barn loft, ate simple, spoke rarely. In his spare time, he would sit by the river beyond town, knife in hand, whittling small wooden birds from scraps of driftwood. Some days, the children of the town would spy him watching them play from a distance. A faint smile on his face, gone before anyone could wave. There was a long scar on his neck, slashing from jaw to collarbone, that made his voice ragged, quieter than most. Some said it came from battle, others from refusal to carry out orders. He never said, he only watched, he only listened. That morning, he watched as Lillian Finch crossed Main Street, her 5 children in tow. She had found strength enough overnight to braid her hair neatly, though her hands trembled from the cold. They stopped outside the boarding house, where the town's matron, Mrs. Kelty, stood waiting with arms crossed. "I heard you might have a room," Lillian asked. Her voice did not beg, it was calm, plain. Mrs. Kelty frowned. "Too many children. I cannot have that many feet under my roof. It's not a charity." "I can pay," Lillian said quickly. "Not now, but soon. I will find work. You'll want the mission out east. Or the old chapel if you like cold floors." Wade's eyes narrowed. He set his tin cup down gently on the hitching post. He walked across the street without hurry, his boots crunching ice. Lillian turned slightly as he approached, recognition flickering faintly in her eyes. He did not greet her. He did not look at her. He pulled an envelope from his coat and placed it on the table between Mrs. Kelty and the doorframe. "She stays," he said, his voice rough from both cold and memory. "That covers a month." Mrs. Kelty stared. "You're vouching for her?" "I am." With that, Wade turned and walked away, the hem of his coat catching in the wind as he passed the children, never once glancing down. By noon, every corner of Ash Hollow was humming. Wade Monroe just paid for that widow to stay at Kelty's. Didn't say a word to her, just dropped money and vanished. That man either hid his head in the war, or he's got himself a reason to start caring. But Wade did not care for the talk. That evening, he rode north again, disappearing into the white hills that led to Mustang Ridge. He did not look back, but in the pocket beside his heart, he still carried a small, unfinished bird, its wings not yet carved. 3 days after she moved into the boarding house, Lillian was turned out. The children had been too loud, laughing, crying, knocking over a pitcher on the stairs. Mrs. Kelty said it was not personal, just business. "I warned you, 5 children make too much noise for a house meant for quiet." Lillian did not argue. She gathered her things, which were few, and bundled the children in their coats again. By dusk, they were gone from town, pushing a rusted cart down the rutted trail that led toward the tree line west of Ash Hollow. There, half swallowed by pine and snow, stood an old cabin. It leaned slightly to the left, roof sagging in the center. The floorboards groaned with every step, and one window was patched with an old flour sack. No chimney smoke had risen from it in years. Some said it had belonged to a trapper who died with winter still in his lungs. But it had 4 walls, and it was empty. So Lillian moved her children in. She lit a fire from green wood that smoked more than burned. She placed the youngest close to the hearth and gave each of them half a crust of bread, left from a stranger's kindness. That night, the wind clawed at the walls, and Lillian sat awake, listening to every creak of the old house, wondering how long she could pretend she was not afraid. She did not know he had been there. Wade had seen the empty house used again. He had watched from the ridge, horse tied quietly beneath him. That night, when the firelight flickered behind the torn curtain, he rode down under cover of darkness. He said nothing. He brought a bundle of dry straw and pushed it beneath the cabin where the draft seeped in. He hammered the doorframe back into place and leaned a better board across the broken step. At the foot of the door, he left a sack. Inside, a dozen potatoes, 3 turnips, a folded wool blanket. He was gone before dawn. The next morning, Lillian opened the door and found the bundle. She looked around, but the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no trail. Someone must have come late, she murmured. The eldest boy held up the sack. It's not from the town. No one liked us there. Maybe from the mission, she said. Maybe the church. But the next night, more things came. A hatchet with a polished handle, a loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in oilcloth, a piece of cured meat, tied with twine, always left silently, always before sunrise. Lillian never saw who did it, so she told herself what she needed to believe. Someone out there still had a heart. That was enough. Until the day the youngest child saw him. They had been gathering kindling when the little boy wandered ahead into the trees, chasing something in the snow. Lillian called after him, heart leaping in her chest, but her call was answered by a deep voice, steady and calm. He is safe. She ran, barefoot in the snow, and found her son wrapped in the arms of a man she had seen only once, across a street. Wade Monroe. He knelt, the child's small hands gripping his collar. "Thank you, mister," the boy whispered. Wade froze. He looked at the boy, then over the boy's shoulder, where Lillian now stood, breathless and wide-eyed. He said nothing, simply unwrapped the child's fingers from his coat, set him gently down, tipped his hat, and walked away. That night, after the children slept, Lillian found something new on the cabin wall. A drawing, charcoal on pine, crude, childlike. A tall man in a dark hat, standing beside a woman and 5 smaller figures, all of them smiling. And beneath it, written in clumsy letters, "Man with sad eyes. He lives in our house now." The wind scraped against the side of the old cabin, shaking loose bits of snow from the roof, as Wade and the eldest of Lillian's boys, Nathan, worked side by side on the slanted shingles. The boy was quiet for his age, all elbows and silence, but curious. Wade handed him nails, one by one, showing him how to drive them without splitting the wood. "You ever have a boy?" Nathan asked, after a long stretch of quiet. Wade did not answer at first. Instead, he sat back on his heels, gazing out toward the tree line, where snow hung thick on every pine branch, and the sun barely broke through the clouds. "No," he said finally, "but there was one." Nathan paused, hammer halfway raised. Wade exhaled slowly, the cold turning his breath to mist. "Long time ago," he continued, "I rode with soldiers, cavalry. We were sent into Cheyenne country, told to burn what we found. No prisoners, they said, just fire and silence." His voice had a jagged edge now, like the wind coming through a crack in the boards. "There was a boy, no more than 7, stood in the middle of it all, smoke, screaming, firelight on his face. But he didn't run." Wade looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred, calloused from wood and reins and rope. But back then, they had held a rifle. "I dropped the gun, scooped him up, ran into the woods, 20 miles, maybe more. Snow up to my knees, no coat for him, just my own." Nathan did not speak. His eyes were wide. "I tried to keep him warm, held him close, built a fire with my last match, but the wind was too strong. The boy didn't last the night." There was a long silence. "I buried him beneath a birch tree, carved his name into the bark with my knife, not even sure if it was right. I never knew it, but I gave him one." Wade's jaw tightened. "That's when I stopped being a soldier. Not officially, just inside. You can carry a uniform long after you've stopped carrying a reason." He picked up another nail, placed it on the shingle, tapped it with the hammer. "That's why I don't carry a rifle no more," he said, softer now. Not because I'm afraid of killing, but because I learned what it feels like to hold something that's worth saving. Nathan nodded. He did not understand all of it, but he understood enough. As the two worked quietly again, a gust of wind rattled the cabin wall, and snow drifted through a crack they had not patched yet. Wade handed the boy a new board. "Let's fix that. Winter's not done with us yet." The storm arrived like vengeance finally unleashed. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned to iron. Snow fell in thick, choking curtains, pushed sideways by a wind that howled like wolves across the hills. It blanketed the land so fast, even the hardiest ranchers were caught off guard. Trees groaned, roofs creaked. The world faded into white noise and dread. At the edge of Ash Hollow, in a cabin barely held together by nails and prayer, Lillian did all she could. She stuffed rags under the door, wrapped the children in everything warm they owned, rationed the final bits of bread and beans. The fire coughed and hissed, flames licking damp logs with little conviction. She sat with her back to the wall, masking the fear on her face. That night, her youngest cried from hunger. The others didn't. Hunger had grown familiar, a silent ache they no longer named. By morning, the food was gone. Lillian sat by the hearth, cradling an empty pot, staring into the fading glow of coals. Her hands trembled, not just from cold, but from the truth she couldn't escape. There was nothing left to give. 30 miles away, Wade Monroe stood in the shadows of a supply shack at Conley's post. He had ridden all night. Mustang Ridge had nothing. Too many mouths, too little winter feed. But Conley's, he prayed, might still have something left. It did. 1 sack of flour, a tin of beans, a single hard biscuit. The storekeep frowned. "We're shut. What's left is mine." Wade reached into his coat and pulled out all he had, a wad of crumpled bills, a silver pocket watch worn smooth from time, and a carved cedar bird. The man stared. "Important to you?" Wade's voice rasped. "They are now." He left an hour later, sack tied behind his saddle, wind-biting skin like glass. Halfway home, the mare faltered under the weight. Snow piled higher with every hour. Wade whispered to her, coaxing her forward, until her legs gave out on a narrow stretch beyond the ridge. She fell hard. Wade tumbled into a drift, shoulders slamming into frozen earth. Gritting his teeth, he reached for the sack, lashed it tighter across his back, and rose. Step by step, he pushed forward, boots vanishing in the white. His breath came ragged, his limbs screamed. Then came the fall. A hidden ravine. Ice cracked. He plunged, striking stone. Pain bloomed sharp and hot in his side. He bit down on a cry and crawled out, hands scraped, lips split, vision blurred. But he did not stop. Hours later, the cabin appeared, soft-edged and ghost-like through the storm. He staggered into the clearing, fell once more, then crawled the final feet to the porch. Inside, Lillian heard the sound, a faint, heavy thud. She opened the door, expecting the wind. Instead, she found him. Wade Monroe, collapsed against the doorframe, snow crusted on his lashes, shirt soaked through with sweat and melting ice. One hand clutched a sack of flour, the other held something pressed beneath his coat. "Wade," she whispered, falling to her knees. The children crowded behind her, silent and wide-eyed. She dragged him inside, inch by inch, blood roaring in her ears. When she opened his coat, something slipped free and fell to the floor, a folded scrap of paper. Lillian picked it up. Her breath caught. It was her daughter's drawing, a rough charcoal sketch, a tall man in a black hat, holding hands with a woman and 5 children. He had kept it beneath his heart. Wade stirred, fevered, eyes unfocused. "Micah," he murmured. "Stay warm. Don't sleep yet." Lillian pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, voice cracking. "You're not losing anyone today," she whispered. "Not this time." And for the first time in days, warmth returned, not just from the fire, but from the figure lying broken on her floor. A man who had walked through a storm so 6 others wouldn't starve. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered. The snow outside had settled into heavy drifts, piled against the cabin walls like frozen waves. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered now, low and steady, as if mourning something lost. Inside, the cabin glowed with quiet life. Wade Monroe lay in the corner near the hearth, wrapped in layers of wool and blankets, a damp cloth resting on his brow. His breath came shallow, raspy, but steady. The fever had broken, but his body had not yet caught up. Lillian sat beside him, never far. For 2 days she had tended to him, boiling water, wiping his face, spooning broth between cracked lips when he could swallow. She rarely slept. When she did, it was with her hand still resting on his chest, feeling each rise and fall like a silent prayer. The children had gone quiet in his presence, not out of fear, but reverence. They played with softer voices, moved more carefully, stole glances when they thought no one noticed. They understood, even without knowing the full truth, that this man had nearly died for them. One night, after the others had gone to sleep, Lillian stayed awake beside the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She stared into the flickering light for a long time, unsure if the tightness in her chest was fear or something gentler. She looked over at Wade, his face pale and still, the scar on his neck catching the firelight like a pale line of silver. She had not prayed since Thomas died, not once. But that night, her lips parted. "Lord," she whispered, hesitant, "I know I am not one to ask, not any more. But if there is still grace left in this world, if there is any justice at all, please, please, let this man live." She swallowed hard, her voice catching. "If anyone deserves to see tomorrow, it's Wade." She brushed a lock of hair from his damp forehead, her fingers lingering. "He's given more than most ever will, and he never once asked for anything back." The room was still. Then, from the corner, a soft voice, barely above a breath, "Pa." Lillian turned. Her youngest daughter was talking in her sleep, curled up beside the fire with a wooden bird clutched to her chest. "Pa," she murmured again, "don't go." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. She smiled faintly, brushing them away. "They've already decided," she whispered. The next morning, Wade stirred. He blinked against the soft light of dawn, confused at first by the ceiling beams above him, the warmth around him, the scent of stew and firewood. He tried to sit, groaning softly. Lillian was at his side in an instant. "Take it slow," she said gently. "You're not going anywhere just yet." He looked at her, eyes clouded. "How long?" "3 days," she replied. "You were burning up." He nodded once, tried again to rise. "I can't stay," he murmured. "I should go." He swung his legs off the bedding, reached for his coat, but as he stood, a wave of dizziness took him, and he staggered. Lillian caught him, both hands at his chest. "Wade," she said firmly, "you do not have to keep saving us." He stilled. She looked up into his face, voice trembling now. "You already did." She stepped back slightly, but kept one hand on his. "We don't need a hero anymore. We just need you." He stared at her, eyes searching, the quiet war within him written across every line of his face. "I don't know how to stay," he whispered. "You don't have to know," she replied. "You just have to want to." He looked toward the window. Snow still clung to the sill. The world outside was white and cold and distant. But in here, there was light. Lillian took his hand again, softer this time. "Stay." Wade Monroe lowered himself back onto the bedroll, slowly, carefully, as if anchoring himself. He looked at the fire, then at her. And for the first time in years, he smiled, not politely, not out of habit, but from somewhere deep and warm. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. It was early spring when the past came riding back. The snow had begun to recede, revealing mud and frozen roots beneath. Birds had returned to the trees, and children dared to play a little farther from the cabin. For a moment, it seemed the world had remembered mercy. But some men never forget unfinished blood. They came at sunset, 3 riders cutting through the edge of Ash Hollow like vultures circling old bones. Covered in dust, long coats dragging behind them, they rode lean, mean horses and carried pistols that had been used more often than cleaned. Their faces were hardened, leathered by wind and sin. One of them had a broken tooth, another had a scar that split his lip in 2, and the third, tall and lean with a viper tattoo on his neck, rode with a quiet cruelty in his eyes. They dismounted outside the saloon. Inside, a few regulars glanced up, then quickly returned to their drinks. No one wanted to be remembered. No one wanted to be caught in whatever storm was about to follow those boots across the floorboards. The tall one leaned against the bar. "We're looking for someone," he said. His voice was low, slow, and filled with poison. "Woman, 5 brats. Name's Lillian. Used to go by Harper. Her man owed us more than he had, thought he could run before paying." He spit on the floor, smiling. "Guess he ran out of luck, just like she will." The barkeep said nothing, but someone whispered. Someone always did. That night, as the sky turned deep with purple, the riders made their way down the old trail toward the cabin outside town. Lillian was feeding the fire when she heard hooves. She stepped out onto the porch, apron still tied at her waist, eyes narrowing as the horses approached through the trees. Her children sensed it before they saw it, fear settling like dust in their throats. The men stopped just beyond the clearing. "Well, well," the viper-necked one drawled. "Ain't this a picture? Little house, big mistake." Lillian moved in front of the doorway, blocking it with her body. "I have nothing," she said coldly. "He's dead. There's no debt left to collect." "See," one of the men said, chuckling, "that's where you're wrong. Thing about unfinished business is, it don't just disappear when someone dies." Another stepped forward. "You think just cause some broken-down ex-soldier's been hanging around, that makes you safe?" From behind her, small feet shifted on the wooden floor. One of the boys stepped beside her, trembling but defiant. That was when Wade Monroe stepped through the doorway. He was quiet, barefoot, wearing his old coat, the one patched at the sleeves. His revolver hung at his hip, not for show, but because he had felt this moment coming. He looked at the men, then past them, then back. "I know who you are," the viper-neck said. "You're that one, right? The coward soldier? The man who walked out of Cheyenne country without firing a single damn shot. The one who let 'em live." He sneered. "They said you don't shoot. Not anymore." Wade's voice was low, firm. "If you came here looking for that man, the one who walked away from killing, you picked the wrong day." He stepped down off the porch. "I gave that part of myself up, buried it, but I'll dig it out if I have to." He moved like a man who had done this before, like a man who hated it but knew it well. "I don't want blood," Wade said, "but I'll spill it to keep them safe." The viper-necked man drew first. He was fast. But Wade was faster. One shot, clean, precise. The man dropped instantly, dead, before he hit the ground. The other two froze. Wade's revolver was still raised. His hand didn't shake. "Go," he said. They went. The hooves thundered into the trees, swallowed by the dusk. Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The children clung to her skirts, silent. Wade turned back toward the cabin. The gun lowered. The weight of it seemed heavier than ever. He walked past Lillian, past the children, and set the revolver down on the table without a word. Then he sat by the fire, head bowed, and closed his eyes. He had not saved them with silence this time. He had saved them with the one thing he had sworn never to use again. And he would carry that, for them. The snow outside had begun to melt, retreating into the thirsty earth like a beast finally sated. Sunlight spilled through the cabin windows for the first time in weeks, casting long, golden beams across the floorboards. Inside, the warmth was no longer just from the fire. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat filling the air. Fresh bread cooled on the table, baked from the flour Wade had nearly died carrying home. Lillian moved between the small kitchen space and the table, ladling broth into tin bowls, her apron dusted with flour, her hair tied back in a loose braid. The children laughed, real laughter, high, unguarded, alive. They jostled for places around the table, arguing over who got the bigger slice of bread or the last piece of carrot. Nathan poured water from a jug. The youngest clapped along to an imaginary song, and in the corner, near the rocking chair, Wade sat with his knife and a block of cedar. He had been working on it since dawn. With careful, practiced hands, he whittled until the shape emerged, a bird with outstretched wings, head tilted skyward as if caught mid-flight. It was rough in places, but smooth where it mattered. He ran his thumb along the wings one last time, then turned to the little girl at his feet. "This is for you," he said, offering it to her. She took it with both hands, wide-eyed, and examined it closely. "It looks like Pa," she giggled. Wade blinked. Then he smiled, soft and quiet. Lillian, watching from across the room, said nothing. She only tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and let the warmth bloom quietly in her chest. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep in their makeshift beds beneath the loft, Lillian sat at the table with a sheet of parchment. She dipped the quill carefully, her handwriting steady. "Dear Sarah," she wrote to her sister in Missouri, "I once told you this land would break a person before it ever gave them something back. I believed that for a long time. But something changed. We were nearly starved, frozen, forgotten, and then came a man, not with promises, or sermons, or gold, but with quiet hands and a stubborn heart. He never asked for thanks, never asked to stay, but he did. I have met the kindest man in a place where kindness has no reason to survive. And now, we are surviving too." She folded the letter, set it aside to dry, and turned toward the window. Wade sat near the fire, one leg stretched out, the other bent, whittling another piece of wood. The glow lit up the side of his face, the scar catching a faint glimmer like silver in twilight. She walked over and sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "The children, they will not go hungry again, will they?" Wade turned to her, his voice low but certain. "Not while I'm breathing." They sat like that for a long while, two people who had been strangers once, now tethered not by blood, but by something steadier. Outside, the wind had quieted, and inside that small cabin on the edge of a town that had forgotten mercy, they shared their first full meal, not just with full stomachs, but full hearts. Because in the end, they had eaten not only bread and soup, but faith in a man the world had never deserved. And so, from hunger came hope. From silence, a family. And in the heart of a frozen land where mercy was a stranger, love carved itself quietly into the wood grain of a one-room cabin. Wade Monroe did not ride off into the sunset. He stayed because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is remain. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of the wind, the warmth of the fire, or the strength of love born in silence, do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales that ride the fine line between heartbreak and healing. Because here, we tell the stories where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Until next time, keep riding toward the stories that matter.